We are back and we are joined by Matt Bruenig of NLRB Edge, a labor law publication. He's also a labor lawyer who has worked for the National Labor Relations Board and a number of unions. Matt, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I guess I just wanted to start here with you because we were just going through this insanity. There's a lot of theories about Trump's motivations with these tariffs. Like, what does he understand trade deficits even are, is my question.
Yeah, I mean, that's its own, interesting element of it. I mean, I don't know what all the theories you've gone through about how people have tried to kind of dress up what he's doing, whether he's trying to bring down interest rates or onshore manufacturing or whatever it happens to be, bring down oil prices. What he has consistently said for decades, and he just said again last night, is that essentially he believes that if you sell more goods to a country than they sell to you, then you're essentially losing money. That you're kind of giving them money. And he's been speaking like this forever. I remember when he first became president, he said that we subsidize Canada to the tune of something like $200 billion a year, which is not us sending money to Canada, but is just how much we buy from Canada more than they buy from us. So he just seems to believe that if you buy more from one entity than they buy from you, then you're kind of losing money. They're like taking money from you.
Right, but obviously the United States as the global capitalist superpower, that's going to be the instance in many different cases with a variety of countries. Like, we can't produce so many of the goods that he's saying are the result of people ripping us off. Like, good luck with creating diamond mines here. Good luck getting coffee grown in the United States. I mean, this is just like, he doesn't seem to fundamentally get that some of this stuff is just not possible.
Yeah, and it's especially weird that he applies it on a country by country basis. Some people can have concerns with the overall trade deficit, but to go to each particular country and suggest that you're supposed to sell more to them or the same amount to them as they buy from you for that specific country, for all 100 plus of them, is kind of wild. And I know there's been a lot of people trying to come up with analogies for this to try to get people's head around it. Probably the best I've seen is to think about your household and the trade deficit that you run with the local grocery store, where you buy a lot of stuff from that grocery store, but obviously they don't buy very much from you. And that's all well and good because you run a big trade surplus with your employer, where they buy a lot of labor from you, but you don't necessarily buy as much in exchange from them. And, we do this with all sorts of entities. And to pick each specific one and to say, hey, I buy more from you than you buy from me is, it makes no sense. Even among people who are very trade skeptical and worried about the trade deficit, they don't do it what's called bilaterally, country by country by country, like he does.
And labor's reaction to the tariffs. I mean, I can see some of where Sean Fain is coming from. And, obviously 20% of our economy is the auto industry. And so it would benefit a lot of workers to have some of these parts manufactured here in the United States. But clearly the broad-based nature of this is going to have a compounding effect on working class people, given the fact that it just kind of functions as a regressive sales tax in practice.
Yeah, I think it's also important to identify, the difference between the goal and the mechanism. So if you're someone like Sean Fain who thinks it would be very useful to onshore certain kinds of automotive production, some of the parts that are made in Mexico or whatever down the line, that's all well and good, but then you have to ask yourself, is this the way to achieve it? Is this the best way to achieve it? To slap, random-ish tariffs on 100 plus countries around the world? No, right? There's something called industrial policy, which is, when you're trying to promote certain kinds of industries or sectors, grow employment in those industries and sectors. And tariffs is one possible tool of industrial policy, but there are other tools as well. And even if you're using tariffs as a tool, this sort of indiscriminate, sort of random tariff slapping, doesn't really achieve that goal. I think a good contrast to this would be, during the Biden administration, they really wanted to increase semiconductor construction or manufacturing in the U.S. because we didn't have a lot of that. And they had this whole policy of subsidies and other kinds of things to get, was a TMSC, to build a semiconductor plant in Arizona, and it's about to start producing chips like pretty soon. Like that's all been very successful, right? So,
Right.
there are smart ways to do that, and I think Fain maybe should think a little bit more about, does this achieve the goal of onshoring automotive production or not, and is it the best way to do it?
Like the tariffs would have to come after the industrial policy. That's what I just, and there's no industrial policy except we have chips that is still hanging on, but Trump has said that he wants to repeal the bill. I saw that there were some upstate upstate New York lawmaker that was getting a little bit scared by that talk, because the CHIPS Act has been a significant benefit to New York State in particular. There's been some more investment in trying to create those semiconductor facilities here in this state too, Arizona as well.
Yeah, and I think one aspect of that is the public investment function, right? So if the tariffs work the way it's supposed to work, kind of in the perfect world, is you slap these tariffs on these parts that are coming from the other countries, and then you hope that private capital will go in and start building all these facilities, investing all this capital to replace those parts, to build them locally in the U.S. And that's quite a fingers crossed kind of scenario. And I think it's very obvious that there's not a whole lot of appetite for that in this scenario, where the tariff situation is so unstable. No one knows how long they're going to last, et cetera, et cetera. So with CHIPS, you kind of had both sides of it, right? The public investment and then maybe some protectionist measures as well. Here, you just kind of protect, and then you hope that capital helps you out. And reality capital is just going to flee to the less risky investments right now.
If capital was allocating itself in a way that benefited our economy, I don't know if the amount of investment in AI compared to how, say, DeepSeek was created in China would count as an efficient orientation of the amount of investment money in this country.
Sure. And I mean, look, capital is seeking a return. It doesn't care what the industrial or sectoral composition of the U.S. is. Public investment can be directed towards that. But private investment, unless you set up the return environment so that it perfectly aligns with that goal, they're not going to put their money where you want them to.
Right. Well, I appreciate your thoughts on that. Let's turn to the NLRB and the news from, I guess it was this morning, you wrote about in NLRB Edge about how Gwen Wilcox, who is the Democratic appointed board member for the NLRB, has been reinstated, at least for now. Trump tried to fire her fairly early on in his presidency, although, God, it's been like less than 3 months. But yeah, I mean, it was in January he fired her, which is supposed to be illegal. Then there have been some back and forth in the courts. Take us through this saga and why it's so important now that she's been reinstated.
Yeah, so for the last, almost before Trump, if you think about 2 years before Trump got in, there's been this theory. I mean, I guess you could run it back decades if you wanted to, but the most active application of this theory that says that the board members at the NLRB and really leaders at almost all these other administrative agencies, their removal protections that exist that prevent them from just being fired for any reason, they have to be fired for cause, that those are unconstitutional. And so in the Fifth Circuit, they've been, that's essentially the law in the Fifth Circuit. It has been for the last couple of years. But it hadn't gotten up to the Supreme Court yet. So when Trump got into office, obviously as part of the kind of like conservative legal movement, Federalist Society type block of the legal profession, they were able to get through this idea. Let's start firing some people that it says we can't fire, and then we'll challenge those restrictions on termination. We'll make a constitutional challenge against them. So he fired a lot of people. It was Gwen Wilcox at the NLRB. There was another person at the Merit Systems Protection Board. I think some FTC people have been fired. All these people are not supposed to be fired. according to the statute. But, Trump and the conservatives are hoping the Supreme Court will say, oh, those restrictions are unconstitutional. The president needs to have the power to fire anyone in the executive. So, yeah, 8 days into the presidency, fires Gwen Wilcox. A little over a month later, the D.C. District Court puts Gwen Wilcox back in, reinstates her, says this was illegal. Then we had this D.C. Circuit panel stay that, and so they essentially refired her. And then the entire D.C. Circuit came back and then reinstated her. So she's been fired, reinstated, fired, reinstated. And when she clicks on and off the board goes from having a quorum to not having a quorum. So for a month there, even when she was in power, they've only really issued maybe 2 or 3 decisions since January 28th, the whole agency. So for as long as we're having this problem, she's getting kicked in and out of office. The NLRB is not able to issue decisions, which means that, essentially any employer that's really dedicated can just refuse to follow the National Labor Relations Act, which is our private sector unionization law.
So it had the potential, or we'll see how this court battle plays out, but it has the potential to freeze labor disputes and basically give free rein to any employer that wants to union bust. It has the potential to do that for the rest of Trump's term if they are unable to reach a quorum, and if, say, the Supreme Court sides with him on this.
Yeah, and I mean her term was going to end in a couple years anyway, so he could bring it down to less than a 3-member quorum after that point. There were 2 periods in the 2000s where the board did not have a quorum. During those periods, it wasn't clear that they didn't have a quorum, so they still kind of operated. Now we're to the point where we all know what the quorum rules are, so it would essentially make the board not functional. And I'll say even right now, even though she just got reinstated today, because it's unclear whether the Supreme Court is ultimately going to say she can or can't be fired, any decisions that she makes over the next year, 2 years, whatever, how long it takes for the Supreme Court to deal with this issue, there's no certainty at all that those decisions are going to stand. They could be retroactively invalidated because she'll be determined to have been on the board illegally. So even right now, if you're really, really dedicated as an employer, you could appeal the board's decision against you up to a circuit court and say, oh, this decision was unconstitutional, it was illegal because Gwen Wilcox was not a legal board member. So it's almost not really functional even with her on the board right now. And
how does this decision to, according to the statute, illicitly fire her, how does that pair with the overall efforts by Trump and Russ Vought and the administration in reclassifying so many of these federal workers in a manner that makes it easier under Schedule F, which Biden reversed and then Trump reversed again?
Yeah, it's all part of the same kind of conservative legal movement, what they call the unitary executive theory, where I
remember that from back in the Bush days. Yeah, I mean, they're perfecting it now.
There's this sentence in the Constitution, which is, a very short, vague document that says that the president must take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And so they read into the phrase take care to mean that he needs to be able to fire anyone in the executive at will, et cetera, including these appointees who are meant to be part of independent agencies and whatever. So, that's the kind of that's the sort of weird, almost juvenile thing that we're engaged in, is figuring out whether take care means that or not. And so it's all part of the same. It all stems from that, really.
Right. What does is mean? It's just this kind of, it's amazing how these conservative Federalist Society freaks can bend every word to mean exactly what they want. And also, as you write, the case law seems pretty clear if you were actually to cite precedent on this as it relates to the NLRB. Can you talk more about how the Supreme Court has ruled on this in the past that should inform potentially how they'll view it going forward?
Yeah, this is a really kind of a niche thing, but it's been kind of annoying and a little bit scandalous, even aside from what conservatives think the Constitution, what the phrase "take care" means, and that is, what are the lower courts supposed to do when this kind of thing happens, when someone is trying to float a new theory that goes against existing precedent? Because the Supreme Court decided in 1935 in a case called Humphrey's Executor that we're allowed to have removal restrictions for government officials that are on multi-member adjudicatory boards. So the NLRB has multiple members and they adjudicate unfair labor practice disputes and other things like that. So they're clearly covered by that. And that has never been overruled. It was affirmed in a case, 23 years later, called Wiener, and in a more recent case in 2010, they refused to overrule it. So Humphrey's Executor is the law of the land. Now, I think it's pretty likely that this Supreme Court will decide eventually to overturn Humphrey's Executor, but it hasn't yet. So until it has, the circuit courts and the district courts really should just say
they have to defer to the precedent. It's insane that they're not.
Yeah, they should say, look, Humphrey's Executor is the law of the land. We're going to side with whatever. If you want to take it up to the Supreme Court, take it up to the Supreme Court. But instead, you have these conservative judges who write these opinions, and the D.C. panel that initially refired her, the one that got overruled today, they just kind of basically write this opinion where they say, I don't think the Supreme Court's going to uphold Humphrey's Executor anymore. So we're going to go ahead and get her fired again until it gets to that point. And that's not how it's supposed to work. You don't get to predict what the Supreme Court's going to overrule its existing precedent. You just apply the precedent.
Yeah, and do conservatives feel that it would strengthen their case to have these lower courts take their side, so it makes it so that the Supreme Court can overturn Humphrey's Executor because it has the history of the lower courts backing them up, basically?
No, I think what they want to do is just make the whole thing as disruptive and chaotic as they can, because if you make it to where these entities can't, the basic question we're having right now is, are we going to allow these entities to function the way that they have for the last 20, 30, 100 years until the Supreme Court issues a decision? Or are we going to blow them up right now until the Supreme Court issues its decision, right? It's a question, what do we do in this interim period? And so I think they want to see it more chaotic in this interim period instead of just having it run exactly how it has, and then the Supreme Court makes its decision and you keep going. Because once the Supreme Court makes its decision, it's really not, it may not even be that big a deal, right? If they say, okay, look, you now have the president now has the power to fire the head of the Merit Systems Protection Board. Okay, whatever. He probably won't. Who cares? And so, but in this interim period, if you can cause all this chaos, then that can actually create damage. Whereas simply changing the rule on when you can fire someone and then just carrying on like we always have, but now you can fire them, is not that big a deal necessarily.
Right. Well, we're going to be watching that case. You wrote about this, just a few quick stories everyone should check out. NLRB Edge for more news like this. But you wrote, I guess, maybe a week or so ago about this Louisiana charter school fight with the NLRB. This is another case that could have broad implications, I think, especially when you have Trump declaring that his intention is to eliminate the Department of Education, and there's this war on public education as an institution, and it's more this like absorption of of charter school policy where public money goes to these private institutions. How does that affect labor disputes within those schools?
Yeah, so there's actually an interesting case at the Supreme Court coming up soon that's also related to that NLRB case. But the charter school situation is very interesting because you run into a question of, are these public schools or are they private schools? And if they're public schools, then they're governed by each state's public sector labor law. If they're private schools, then they're governed by the National Labor Relations Act, and we'd go through the NLRB process. And lo and behold, what you'll find is these states, especially the conservative states like Louisiana, they want them to be private until the NLRB says, okay, well, if they're private, then they can be unionized under private sector labor law. And then at that point, they come back and say, oh, no, they're public. And they'll try to make little changes in the law to make them seem a little bit more public,
Right.
maybe give state officials more power over the board. But then we have this case at the Supreme Court where you have the reverse kind of desire, which is that these states also, this is happening in Oklahoma, they want to allow religious charter schools that still receive public money. And so if they're public schools, well, you can't have a religious public school, right? That's a First Amendment problem. If they're private schools, then, you do have private religious schools, and some of them do receive public financing, so that might be allowed. But if they're private, if we're going to call these private, then now we've reintroduced the problem that you can unionize them under the NLRA, which they also want to avoid. So they want it to be public for certain purposes, private for other purposes, all to kind of get their end goal, which appears to be a union-free religious school system that's still taxpayer funded.
Can you speak about that a little bit more, just how we can view some of these attacks on education via their hatred of teachers' unions? Because I'm old enough to remember Fox News had an obsession with teachers' unions in particular. They're okay with other public sector unions like cops, but teachers' unions bother them. And a lot of the COVID culture war stuff and when you saw how teachers unions were standing up and saying we want to be safe in schools, like that infuriated them as well. Teachers unions are a big thumb in the eye of a conservative ideology in their agenda.
Yeah, and even for a time, the sort of more like center liberals were really interested in education reform, as it was called, the education reform movement, which focused a lot on teacher unions as well. That's where we get the charter schools that are meant to shed these teacher unions. And
Cory Booker comes to mind as somebody in my home state, right? Give
rise to these legal disputes now that we're having over them. But the U.S. has a lot of inequality. I don't know if you've noticed that. It's extremely unequal. There's a lot of poverty. And I think there's one of the big questions in our politics is fighting over why is that? Like, what's the issue? What do we do about that? And I think one easy scapegoat is to say, well, it's because our education system is so bad. And why is it so bad? Well, it's because of the teacher unions, because you can't fire them. And it's a very lazy way around, a lazy way to explain why we have such high inequality and such high poverty and avoid the issue. And then we can focus our energies on getting rid of the teacher unions, charter schools, education reform, and we don't have to deal with things that might actually reduce inequality, like, the welfare state, universal health care, cash benefits, free child care, on and on down the line. We don't have to do the taxing. We don't have to do the welfare state. All the problems spring from the bad public education, which itself springs from the teacher unions.
Well, Matt, really appreciate your time today, everybody. As I keep plugging, check out NLRB Edge. Thanks so much for coming on and explaining some of this stuff to us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.